these programs are entirely worthwhile. They are great. They help you do things that you didn't think you could afford to do. Maybe you can do more or you can do better if you could get some cost share assistance from the government to do these things.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Job Done Right podcast. We stream a new episode every 2 weeks, starting in the spring and going through fall. Our goal is to provide useful advice on controlling weeds and insects and growing forage, grass, and wildlife food plots. If you find Job Done Right useful, we hope you'll subscribe, share it with your friends, and let us know your thoughts. We make new episodes based on your input, so voice your opinion. Our guest today is retired University of Georgia Extension Director, Lanny Lanier. Today, Lanny shares his advice on food plots. We discuss establishing a plot and making it productive, and we'll also learn about the ways you might be able to get paid for putting in wildlife food plots. That will be interesting. Lanny, welcome back to the Job Done Right podcast. So great to have you again.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, now that we are in the depths of summertime, it might seem early for people to start thinking about their fall food plots, but you say that's not the case. For people located in the U.S., what should they be doing now when they're thinking about their food plots for the fall?
Well, you need to have a plan. And the first thing to do is to have a soil test and make sure that your pH is in good order. Take your soil samples. You can send them to your local county extension office, or you can send to one of many commercial labs. Also, a lot of fertilizer dealers will send the samples in for you to a certified lab, and you'll get a recommendation. But the first dollar that you always need to spend on a food plot is to spend your first dollar on lime. That is the most important thing you can do. You can have the greatest variety and you can have the best fertilizer, but the pH of the soil really determines how much success you will have.
Okay, good to know. You mentioned lime there. You mentioned fertilizer. What are some other general rules of thumb when it comes to getting ready for your food plot?
Well, have a plan. For food plots, if you're specifically looking at deer, I'd encourage you to take a look at a little bit bigger picture. You may manage for duck, you may manage for turkey, you may manage for quail, it may be pheasants, it may be something else. Don't just zero in specifically on deer. Try to look at something that's going to be a total improvement to your wildlife habitat. Look at several different species, and don't be so conscious on nothing but deer that you overlook something that might be a great thing for other species. So what's generally good for deer is good for other things, but have some variety, have some diversity in your mix. Don't plant the same thing in every location. Try to mix it up.
Let's start off with some basics here. When it comes to preparing the soil, what do people need to know?
Well, if you have access to a tiller or some type of power-driven machine that can till up soil, it may just be a disc or it may be a rototiller, or you may have some type of no-till equipment. I'm trying to make things easy for people to use what they have and not have to go out and buy lots of expensive equipment. You can no-till and have very successful food plots without really using much tillage equipment at all. What we would do, and what I've done for several years, is that in the summer, the plots get a little overgrown. I will go in and mow about a month before I want to apply my glyphosate. Or you can not mow at all. But if you do mow, you want to leave time for that plant material to decompose on top of the ground so it doesn't block your glyphosate from reaching the stubble that you want to kill. So if you mow, leave plenty of time to have litter to decompose. But spray with glyphosate, wait about 2 weeks at the minimum, because you want the stubble to be really, really dry and crumbly. And then you can plant using a conventional grain drill, or you can broadcast over the top without using any equipment at all. And try to time it right before a rain. If you've got a storm on the way or you've got heavy rain forecast, try to do it the day before that, because the rain will beat down a lot of that dry, dead stubble, and you'll get good seed to soil contact, and you'll get a good stand that way. But getting a good stand is the most important thing that you'll do. And you don't need to have a great amount of money invested in equipment to make that happen.
That's great to know for all of those that don't want to invest in all the fancy equipment yet. Now, you mentioned soil sampling earlier, and I know soil sampling is really recommended for food plots and all forage production generally. Would you walk us through some of the basics when it comes to soil sampling?
Yes, you need to have your own soil sample probe. You can buy those at the farm supply dealers, or you can get them online. Go ahead and invest and get a good one, and take your samples. Soil samples are a little finicky, but they're not difficult. If you take your samples this time of the year, late summer or going into the early fall is the best time, because that's when your pH will always be the lowest. It has a natural cycle. pH is always the lowest late summer and fall. If you take your samples in the spring when it's really, really wet, you tend to get a little higher pH, but that's not always a true reading. So take your samples summer and fall and fertilize and lime accordingly. If you need at least a ton to the acre of lime and you have large plots, you can go to your fertilizer dealer. Most dealers have a buggy that they will rent at a very nominal cost that you can take and you can use, and when you finish you can bring it back. If you have small plots, you may have to use a broadcast distributor. Some hook behind tractors, some go behind four-wheelers, some are done by hand. And if you buy bagged lime, you'll spread it that way. It's a lot more work, but on small plots or remote locations, that's what you'll need to do. But first dollar, always spend it on lime.
Okay. Once you've done all that and it's finally time to seed, what types of forage plants do you recommend?
In our food plots here, and in this part of the country, the mainstay, the bulk of what goes out will be an improved variety of oats. And Ragan Massey has some really good oat varieties, and I'm planning to use some of those this year. But oats is the mainstay, and in addition to the oats, sometimes you mix in some rye, but typically it's predominantly oats. And we have a mix. Sometimes we add some Austrian winter peas. Sometimes we add some dwarf Essex rapeseed, which is a brassica. Some of the canola varieties work excellent as well. And then sometimes we add one of the clovers. One of the red clovers typically is what we would use. And when you use that mix, you have to be careful with it, because don't plant too deep. If you plant as deep as the oats always like, you have planted your clover too deep. So back off on the depth if you're using a drill or a machine to plant, and don't plant those small seeds too deep. That's a mistake that a lot of people make, and we want to try to prevent that. Don't plant those tiny seeds too deep.
I understand there's a book out there that you really recommend when it comes to people trying to figure out how to set up their food plots. Do you want to talk about that one a little bit?
Yes, I do. This is a resource that I've used quite a bit, and I'd highly recommend it. It comes from the Alabama Wildlife Federation, and the name of it is simply Managing Wildlife. And it is a comprehensive look at not just deer, but all the species that you may want to take a look at. It talks about planting practices. It talks about varieties. It talks about management strategies. And it's a comprehensive look at managing the total wildlife population in a region. It talks about diversity of plants. It talks about diversity of species and what you can do to have a good strategy on your property. And I'd highly recommend you taking a look at purchasing this book. It's been very helpful to me, and I'm sure it will be helpful to you.
Great. We'll make sure to post a link to that book. Now, there's one last item I'd like to discuss with you that a lot of our listeners might not know about. I know I didn't realize this, but I understand there are ways to get reimbursed for putting in food plots. I'm sure many of our listeners have been putting in food plots on their own dime for years now, but tell us a little bit about how they might get some of their costs covered in the future.
Okay, you need to go online to farmers.gov, farmers.gov, and that is a link to the USDA website. And specifically, you want to go to the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and look at the programs that are available. And I like to mention 3 specific programs that you may qualify for. And one thing is for certain, you will never get any money if you don't go and apply and ask, because these programs are entirely worthwhile. They are great. They help you do things that you didn't think you could afford to do. Maybe you can do more or you can do better if you could get some cost share assistance from the government to do these things. 3 programs that NRCS has that I want to lift up. First one is CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. That is where they will offer long-term payments. A contract for that could be as long as 15 years, and that is to convert land back into native species. For us in this part of the country, that will be longleaf pine. And I have a contract approved. We will be converting land back into longleaf pine, which was a native species. In other parts of the country, it may be native grasses. But longleaf pine and native grasses are the 2 things that they are looking at in CRP, and that's up to a 15-year contract. An intermediate term contract of 5 years is something called the Conservation Stewardship Program, and that would include wildlife food plots. It may be prescribed burning, it may be thinning timber, it may be a variety of other practices that you could do on your property, which you could be reimbursed for. And again, the rate is entirely worthwhile. I would highly recommend it. I've had a CRP contract for 15 years. I've had multiple CSP contracts. They're 5 years each. And the last one I want to mention is called EQIP. And that is a short-term program. It's for like replanting cut over trees or installing a practice. It might be an erosion control practice. It might be fencing livestock out of the stream. It might be doing something to enhance an environmentally sensitive area that you may have on your property. But they're all entirely worthwhile. The government spends money on lots of things, and I recommend that they spend some money on your property if you qualify. The thing to do is to go to the website, find your local office, contact your local conservationist, and have a conversation about what it is that you want to do on your property, what you want to accomplish on your property, and see what you may qualify for. You may not qualify for anything, but again, you might. You don't know until you fill out an application and then have a consultation with a conservationist. They will look at your property. They'll look at the aerial photographs. They may make a site visit, and they may look at what it is that you want to do. And they'll tell you if that's feasible or not, and if it's something that that the USDA wants to get involved in, they can give you some significant cost share assistance to do those things. I highly recommend it. Take a look at it, and it's really the way to go if you qualify.
Certainly worth checking out for everybody. It sounds like a win-win for the landowner and for the environment. So great advice overall. We really, really appreciate your time today and all the information. Thank
you very much. My pleasure.
We've posted links to the advice section of RaganandMassey.com, where you can get more information on food plot cost share and management resources. These include the website farmers.gov and the book Managing Wildlife. You can also seek out your local NRCS office, your State Department of Natural Resources, or groups like Pheasants Forever, the National Wild Turkey Federation, and Whitetails Unlimited. For more questions and answers about food plots and plot spike seed, visit the advice section of RaganandMassey.com. You can also visit the Ragan and Massey channel on YouTube for dozens of informative videos, including several about food plots. Make sure to subscribe to the Job Done Right podcast and tell your friends too. If you have questions you'd like answered on the podcast, please share them with us through RaganandMassey.com or on social media. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time on the Job Done Right podcast.